Good morning, everyone. This is William Cross. I am teaching the certification exam study guide here. So today we're going to be looking at the structure of the exam itself, as in what's it going to feel like when you're taking the exam. We're going to be looking at the topics covered. We're going to be doing some practice questions, and there's going to be a little time for Q&A at the very end. So first off, let's talk about the exam structure. Why do we have the exam at all? Well, we've got the exam to recognize developers and DBAs who have MongoDB skills that make them valuable, and we want to provide potential employees with a means to determine if an employee has the skills they need. So ideally, we want you to be able to signal your MongoDB skills by showing a good score on this exam to a potential employer. When you actually take this exam, you're going to need to be alone. You're going to need to be either at home or somewhere else, but you need to be the only person in the room. You can't take it, for example, in a crowded office. You're not allowed to have any reference materials. We do understand that some people are not using English as their first language. So we do allow you to use a translation software, for example, Google Translate. That won't disqualify you. But on the other hand, you can't have a shell open. You can't have a reference book open. It's a little bit of an artificial environment. We acknowledge that, but these steps are necessary in order to ensure exam integrity. For that same reason, your desk has to be clean. We're going to need a shot of the desk to make sure, like literally you'll have to, if you're using, for example, a laptop, pick it up and show the desk to see that, your desk is clean and there aren't any reference materials. You can also have only one monitor so that we can be confident about what you're looking at, and once again make sure that everything or all of the rules are being followed. All of these, by the way, are just to ensure exam integrity. If there's a problem, there's going to be a proctor who's going to be looking at you while you're taking the exam. They should be informing you if there are any issues. If, for example, I see someone in the room, you're going to need to be alone. They should be able to tell you, no, you need to tidy up this desk. I wouldn't be able to verify the integrity of this, or you need to remove your monitor, things of this nature. So some people are a little surprised by that, but yeah, definitely expect there's going to be a person watching you the entire time through your webcam. This is why you need a camera. In order to demonstrate that you are who we think you are, you need to make sure that you are holding some government identification. A driver's license is a great idea. A passport is a great idea. If you have any sort of national ID, that's going to work as well. Just something for us to verify that you are who you say you are. And again, this all happens sort of over the webcam. In terms of operating systems, you need to be working on a Mac or Windows machine. Either desktop or laptop is fine, but you need to have a webcam. If it's a desktop computer, for example, right now I'm giving this presentation from an iMac. It doesn't have a detachable camera, so that wouldn't work because I'd need to be able to show, the environment. I'd need to be able to give a 360-degree view around the room, show what my desk is. I suppose that it's conceivable if you're, a fairly strong person, you might be willing to pick up a monitor and point it around. But for the most part, if you're using a desktop, make sure that you have a detachable camera. In terms of the rules, you won't be able to navigate to any other websites. You won't be able to view reference material. You won't be able to consult with other people. I mentioned earlier, you can visit a translation website, for example, Google Translate, just to figure out, how to move the words from English to your native language. And during the exam, we're going to be recording three things. We're going to be recording the video feed. So we're going to have a picture of your face and what you're doing. We're going to have the audio feed, which is to say what you're listening to, and what your microphone picks up. And let me see. And we're going to be looking at your computer activity. By the way, because we need to be able to pick up everything that's going on, you're going to want to, or you're not going to be permitted to wear headphones. If you're hearing something, we need to be able to hear it too. So you need to have that microphone on, and you need to be using computer speakers. And as I mentioned during the exam, you are going to be watched by the proctor. Okay, in terms of the question format during the exam, there are two basic types of questions that you're going to be working with. The first is multiple choice. Most of these rules are in place, not for anything having to do directly with the exam, but in order to help ensure integrity. We can't have you, viewing, listening to, or otherwise referencing reference material while using the exam. In order to take the exam, first, we're going to need a profile photo. You're going to want to upload a high-quality photo of yourself. Take it in front of a plain white or off-white background. Image dimensions should be a square aspect ratio, which is to say the height should be equal to the width. This is going to be on your certification itself. So please, choose a photograph that presents you, the way you want it to be presented to an employer. You're also going to need some identification. You're going to need government ID, driver's license, a passport, a national ID, something along these lines, just so that we can verify that you are who you say you are. And again, this is, incidental to the exam, but it's something that's important and something you need to have in place. In terms of what you need to have with you, it can be a Mac or a Windows machine, not Linux. We haven't been able to get Linux working with Examity. We haven't, as I said, we haven't been able to get Linux working. I wouldn't try it. Yeah, that's it. And they don't support Linux at this point, so you're a little bit on your own if using Linux. It can be a desktop or a laptop, but a webcam is required. We are going to need to be looking at you. We're going to need to be picking up everything on the microphone that one can hear in the room. Again, I mentioned earlier, you can't have headphones. That's just to have a basic layer of certainty that we can hear what you're hearing. By the way, worth noting, if it is on a desktop, that's fine, but you need to be able to point the video all around the room so we can examine the room, including the desk itself. Right now, I'm giving this talk from an iMac. It's a pretty sizable monitor. I would not, for example, want to take the exam using an iMac with its built-in camera, just because I would have to pick up the monitor and who knows what would happen if I dropped it or something. So if it's a desktop, that's fine, but we would strongly recommend a detachable camera so that you can show off the room. During the exam itself, once that's been verified, it's just going to be the proctor looking at you personally. You can be working alone, or you need to be working alone. It could be at home, it could be at an office, it could even be at an internet cafe. So long as you could get a room all to yourself with nobody else in there while you took the exam. So during the exam, you will not be able to navigate to websites, view reference material, consult with others. We don't allow you to open, for example, a Mongo shell. And again, this is just to protect the integrity of the exam. But you can visit a translation website, such as Google Translate. We understand that many of you taking the exam may not use English as your first language. That's totally fine. Using a translation software is absolutely acceptable, given some of the questions we ask about. We try not to make them, overly difficult in terms of their language, but it can be difficult, and most of these questions are created by someone for whom English is their first language. During the exam, we're going to record your computer activity, which is to say, your entire desktop, whatever you're displaying on your monitor. We're going to be recording the audio stream from the microphone, and we're going to be recording a video stream, which mostly is just going to be your face as you take the exam. Now, just to be clear, during this exam, you're going to be watched by a proctor. If they see something go wrong, they're going to tell you that something is going wrong, something that violates the exam. For example, if you're alone in this room and someone walks up to you, they're going to say, hey, you can't be talking to people during this exam. It violates the integrity of the exam. You're going to need to stop that. Ideally, that wouldn't have to happen at all, but it is there, and we will have the videos later for review so that we can decide whether or not we need to reject things based on the evidence we see. All right, let's get to the question format itself. So on this exam, there are going to be two basic types of questions. There are going to be multiple choice questions and check all that apply questions. For the multiple choice questions, typically there's only going to be one correct option. In almost all cases, 5 options will be given, so you need to select the best one. And just to be clear, you want to guess. This is also true for check all that apply questions. You always want to guess. There is no penalty for guessing, but if you leave a question blank, you will not be getting it right. By the way, those of you who have taken the exam before, previously, you had to, click submit to enter your question. At this point, the exam should be capturing, as you click things, your answers. So there should never be an issue with that. Check all that apply. Typically, there would be 3 options given. There are a few exceptions. Sometimes a query will be given, and you will be asked, okay, which of the following documents will be affected by the query? And there may be, 5 or more documents. But except for those questions, it should typically be 3 options available. You're going to need to select one of the 3, or 2 of the 3, or all 3 as a correct choice. By the way, just to be clear, with check all that apply, it is never the case that none of the choices are correct. At minimum, at least one of those is going to be correct. There will not be partial credit. This is a question we get sometimes. If you are, let me see. Let's suppose that you need to check all 3 choices to get the correct answer. If you select 2 of the 3, you will not get partial credit. You will be wrong. You will get 0 credit for that problem. You need to get all 3 of the choices correct in order to get the problem correct. Question ordering. Just be aware, most of the answers are randomized, so your answers may not look the same as the person next to you. If by chance you were taking that with a person next to you, which you wouldn't want to do. The only exception is sometimes there's sort of a clear progression in the problem. For example, how many documents are there in this collection? And we might have the answers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those would be in order, so you don't have to hunt around and figure out where exactly, your 5 is going to be, if that's the correct answer. Okay. If you have any issues with one of the questions, maybe there are no correct answers, maybe there are 2 correct answers, maybe you have an issue with the wording. Beneath each question, you're going to find a link where you can report problems. We are going to be looking at these daily. If there are issues with the problem, and we agree that the problem should not have been given in its form that it was given, we will modify the problem and give credit as appropriate to everyone who has seen the question. Please do give us feedback. We do look at it daily. We may, from time to time, someone may, submit a question where we think that the question remains valid. But like I said, at the very least, we're going to be looking into all of your concerns. Time allotted. This exam is 90 minutes. That's true whether it's a dev exam or a DBA exam. It's going to contain 60 to 70 questions, so you'll have somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 to 90 seconds per question. Typically, it's close to the high end of that, so about a minute and a half per question is what you can expect. There is no penalty for incorrect answers, and you should definitely guess, never leave a question blank. What topics are we going to cover in the exam? So the Dev exam and the DBA exam have, a fair amount of overlap, but they also have a fair amount of stuff that's on their own. Philosophy and features, we'll ask a little bit about the database. We'll talk in a moment about what the topics for each of these sections is going to be. But yeah, both of them lead in with sort of the philosophy and features of MongoDB from, a very high level view. CRUD, create, read, update, and delete options will be next. This is going to feature a lot larger in the developer exam than in the DBA exam, even though they're both going to have it. And that makes sense. Your create, read, update, and delete options weigh a lot more heavily in terms of what you're going to be using on a regular basis if you're a developer versus a DBA. Indexes are going to be in both sections, as is aggregation. In the case of aggregation, it's going to favor, much like CRUD, much more heavily for the developers than it does for the DBAs. But at minimum, with the DBAs, you should, understand the nature of the aggregation pipeline, be able to write out a few queries, be able to recognize valid versus invalid queries. So there'll be, at least a couple of questions for the DBA, significantly more for the developers. Replication and sharding are going to be present in both exams. Yes, there is going to be a difference. I see that there's a question in the forums. In this particular case, with both replication and sharding, you're expected to understand them a great deal deeper as a DBA versus as a developer, which again makes sense. They have a lot more to do with the systems rather than with sort of coding applications. However, even for a developer, there's enough that you need to know. For example, when you're talking about write concern, read preference, with sharding, understanding the nature of the shard key can often be a big deal, and you would potentially be a part of that process. So in the case of those, there are areas that are a little bit more developer focused, but for the most part, the DBAs are expected to know a fair amount more. Let's see, there's a question about recommended study materials. We're going to talk about that a bit at the end. But the short answer is, we've got the about pages for the exams when you go to sign up. Definitely be aware. There are some resources listed there. I would recommend going through the documentation. I would recommend, going through the MongoDB glossary, which is a good resource, not necessarily for learning, but for learning, what you don't know yet. Anytime you see a word that you're unfamiliar with, it's definitely something you should look up. I would go to the help output from each of the, server tools, for example, in the shell. And in terms of books, there are a few out there. Yeah. By the way, I skipped over it. One other section that we want to take a look at is data modeling for the developer exam. Now, this isn't going to touch on the DBA exam at all. This will just be the developer exam. And again, this is because of the fact that, the way you model your data will affect performance. And you need to be familiar with that as a developer when you're designing these things. The main sections on the DBA exam that don't appear on the developer exam, application and server administration, which sort of deal with special things that the DBAs don't have to think of for the most part, that you as a DBA do need to consider. All right, let's go over these. This will be taking the bulk of our time, sort of looking at each of the subtopics. So, philosophy and features. Main thing to consider is, the subtopics to consider. First off, be aware of some, basic factors that affect performance, such as choice of storage engine, whether or not you use indexes, the hardware you're on. In this section, it wouldn't be a particularly detailed set of performance affecting factors that we'd ask you about, but just basic stuff that one should be aware of. JSON and BSON, definitely go to json.org and understand the JSON spec. Literally, the entire spec can be written out in less than a page. It's very simple. BSON is a little bit more complicated. We really only want you to know the basics. We're not, for example, going to give you a JSON document and say, convert this to BSON. That isn't something that would factor in terms of whether or not someone was an expert in MongoDB. It's not something we intend to be testing in the certification exam. But nevertheless, you should be aware that BSON is a binary JSON format. You should be aware that it's something that the MongoDB server is able to read, is able to look into, so that when you're building indexes, you can build them on a subfield of that BSON. Things of this nature. Fault tolerance. Basically understand that replication is about fault tolerance. Scaling, as we list a little bit lower, is going to be using sharding. When it comes to disaster recovery, again, replication can help with this, taking backups. But actually, even disaster recovery, I think, is a bit more specific than philosophy and features often gets into. The Mongo shell, we might have a little bit there. Be aware that it's a JavaScript interface. Be aware that be aware that we use it for learning and teaching MongoDB, even though you guys are going to be using your drivers separately. I saw a question earlier about whether or not we are going to ask questions about the drivers. The answer is no. But you should nevertheless be familiar with the Mongo shell, some of its basic methods, some of its basic commands. There you have it. All right. So moving on. CRUD, the create, read, update, and delete section. And again, the basics are going to be necessary for the DBA exam. When it comes to the dev exam, this is, you're going to need to know things fairly in depth. You'll notice for each of these, we list, some of the relevant commands. For create, there's insert, there's save. You might even have, create collection is a creation operation. When it comes to read, db.collection.find. By the way, I'm listing here, how many parameters these two use, or these commands use. Be aware of what they do, depending on the number of parameters you pass. When it comes to db.collection.find, for example, pass 0 parameters, you're going to get your entire collection back, or a cursor at least that's going to walk the entire collection. With 1 parameter, you're going to filter those results down. With 2 parameters, you're going to be projecting only certain fields out. Now, of course, that also doesn't include the options document. Be aware of that. Be aware of what can go in that. Update can be a little bit tricky. Uses 2 parameters: 1 to find what you're going to update, and 1 to actually institute the update itself. In terms of things that sometimes will cause people to trip up on update, first off, be aware of the many parameter. If many is true, you're going to update lots of documents. If many is false, which it is by default, you're only going to update 1 problem at a time. Delete uses the db.collection.remove method. And, on the other, unlike update, it's going to remove all of the documents that it finds unless you have just 1 set to true. So again, for all of these guys, make sure you understand not just which methods you're dealing with, make sure that you understand all of the operators that might be present. Good place to go is the documentation. It's got lists of operators for, say, find, whether it's the query portion or the projection portion, all of the parameters for update. It's a good consolidated place to look. I highly recommend it. All right, for the dev exam only, data modeling, and those of you who are looking forward to taking the DBA exam, this whatchamacallit, you'll just have to wait a moment. I'll be getting back to relevant stuff for you shortly. Okay, so data modeling. What are we going to look for in terms of data modeling? You should make sure you have an understanding of embedding versus references. Specifically, if you do choose to embed your data, what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? If you choose to reference your data, what are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What sort of a use case would favor embedding versus referencing? Generally speaking, embedding is going to allow you to gather more data with a single query, and it may be more efficient for reads. In general, referencing data means that you will have to query more documents for each query. First your initial document and then other documents that it references. That can be fine in the case of just a few references. It can also be somewhat inefficient depending. But be aware of the advantages and disadvantages. One of the advantages of references is that when you perform updates, there's less that you need to update. It's a much more granular update. There can be advantages with that. For mmap v1, and this is kind of a storage engine specific issue. Keep in mind those data files are written out directly in the the documents are written out directly in your data files. So each of them is allocated a certain what we call a record space. And if the document outgrows its record space, it's going to need to move. This is going to affect performance. So if you have a data model that allows for document growth, which is very plausibly the right model, be aware of the trade-offs that may occur. When that document moves, you're going to have to update all of your indexes that point to that document because they essentially point to a location in those data files. Be familiar, and again, a great place to look for this is in the documentation. Be aware of how to model one-to-one relationships. For example, if you've got a person and their social security number, there's one social security number per person, at least in the US, and one person per social security number. So that's a one-to-one relationship. When it comes to one-to-many, an example of that would be, for example, a person and an address. One person, or each person will have, sort of one home address at least, but you may have multiple people per address. When it comes to many, that might be generalized to, a person's properties. A person may have multiple properties. A property may have multiple people with, an ownership interest in it. That's the way it's represented. Be aware of, the patterns one uses to represent those in MongoDB. Next, modeling for atomic operations. Keep in mind, let me see. MongoDB options are not atomic per query, but they are atomic on a document level, which is to say that any given document will either, supposing that you instruct MongoDB to update this document and then the MongoDB server crashes. What will happen is either that document will not be updated or it will be updated completely. There will be no half updates. As a result of this, if, for example, you need two variables to change simultaneously, if they're in the same document, you can have that happen. If they're in different documents, you need to keep track of whether one or both of them has been updated. And that can be a little bit trickier. There are some things that we have, such as two-phase commits, that allow you to work with those. but be aware of when you need that and when you don't. And finally, be familiar with modeling tree structures. Understand what the advantages and disadvantages are for, say, storing a parent of each node in a tree structure. Be familiar with storing a child of each node in a tree structure. Be familiar with saving both, or saving, say, the child subtree or the parental path up, back to the root. All of these are options. All of these are patterns that you may need to be familiar with and may be asked about. Being familiar with them in advance can help move you along quickly. There seems to be a question about storage engines. Yes, we will be asking about storage engines. That's going to be featured more heavily in the DBA exam. In the dev exam, there will be questions about storage engines wrapped into the indexing section. And so they're going to be relatively basic, but we are going to be asking questions about, developer versus DBA. Okay, so indexing. This is a section that both developers and DBAs are going to have. It's also one of the few sections where they're going to weigh in about equally on the exam. First and foremost, be familiar with single key indexes. This is sort of the most basic, most basic way that an index is implemented in MongoDB. We're talking about a single field in a single collection. Be aware of how that changes when you get to compound indexes, which of course are indexes on two fields in a single document, or in a within a single collection, or a set of documents within a collection using the same schema. Those compound indexes, be aware of when you can and when you cannot use them for sorting. When it comes to compound indexes, be aware of when you can use a compound index only on a single field. So for example, if you have, an index on name, birthday, you can use that for queries that involve both name and birthday. You can use that for queries that involve just name, but you wouldn't be able to use those for queries that involve only birthday. Be aware of why that's the case and how the mechanics work out, so that you know when you'd be able to use the same index for multiple different query patterns and when you can't. Next subtopic for indexes is multi-key indexes. So multi-key indexes, even though it doesn't have the name of it anywhere in this, let me see. Quickly, I'm going to address. Someone's asking dev or DBA exam when it comes to storage engines. There's going to be a little bit of storage engine stuff in the DBA exam in data modeling, as well as in indexes. But it's going to go a little bit more in depth when it's in the DBA exam, and it's going to be sort of in application and server administration. Okay, so jumping back in, multi-key indexes are indexes where you have an array. Be aware of when you can and can't use, multi-key indexes and compound indexes. The main rule is just that one multi-key index is allowed, or a multi-key for a compound index, one field can be multi-key. And the reason why that happens is multi-key indexes, like I said, they're indexed on an array field. You're going to potentially have one index point per element in that array. So for example, if your array has 50 elements, you're going to see 50 index entries for that single document. If it has 500, you're going to see 500 entries for that document. That scales up relatively quickly, but still bearable. If we allowed multi-key indexes for multiple fields in a compound index, it would scale up as the Cartesian product of the lengths of those arrays, and so it would scale up rather dramatically. We simply disallow that. Be familiar of when, like I said, multi-key and compound indexes can go together and when they can't. Mechanics of the indexes. We don't go into too much detail, but definitely be aware of, for example, your explain plans and how to use those explain plans, how to read those explain plans, and performance. Generally speaking, when it comes to performance, indexing, or not having indexes is the main determining factor. But for the developer exam, this is where we put storage engine questions. So this is where, we might ask, okay, supposing that you want to work with document level locking, technically document level concurrency, which storage engine would be, to the advantage? And the answer there would be, of course, Wired Tiger would have document level concurrency. Wired Tiger would have collection level locking. Similarly, if, for example, you're really limited by your rate of disk I/O and you have plenty of bandwidth when it comes to, your CPU, a little compression layer might be to your advantage. That would work with Wired Tiger. That would not work with Mmap v1, and so on and so forth. The next subtopic is aggregation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, aggregation definitely is going to feature much more strongly in the developer exam than it does in the DBA exam, but it does appear even in the DBA exam. As of right now, there's no aggregation section for M102, our DBA course, or M202. So it may be something you want to study up a little bit on your own. There are only going to be a few questions for the DBA exam, but you should be familiar with it. The developer exam, on the other hand, is going to have quite a few questions on aggregation. For aggregation, first thing you should know is definitely that you're working within aggregation pipeline. Be familiar with this analogy with Unix pipes. Essentially, you at each stage, you take a set of documents in, and then you take a set of documents out. Those documents may not be the same. Depending on what stage you're using, you could end up with a lot more documents, you could end up with a lot fewer documents, or you could end up with the same number of documents. What just happened? Sorry about that. Operators. Definitely be familiar with aggregation with all of your top level operators. These define, what stage of aggregation you're working with. Be familiar with. Let me see. Be familiar with all of them. Know what lower level operators you're going to be able to use for them. We don't try to have too many gotcha questions, but definitely be able to recognize, okay, this query is valid, that query is not. Next thing you should be aware of, memory usage with the aggregation pipeline. So in MongoDB 3.0, you've got up to 100 megabytes of memory that you can use for the aggregation pipeline. No stage can exceed that. Unless, of course, you use the option allow disk use true, in which case you can use your hard drive to have larger aggregation queries. Behavior specific to sort, skip, and limit. Remember, you always want to sort, then skip, then limit. Be familiar with when the aggregation pipeline is going to change the order of these on you and what optimizations it's going to perform, especially for the developers. Also, something that should be mentioned here but is not mentioned here is, and maybe this is touched upon in the indexes section a little bit as well, when you can use your indexes for aggregation and when you can't. Basically, you're good to go as far as index use until the first group or project operation. Once you group or once you project, essentially you're no longer dealing with the original documents you started out with. It's no longer going to be able to use indexes. by that point in time, you should end up with a relatively small set of documents, because they're going to get expensive to work with. Same thing with sort. You don't want to do an in-memory sort. Ideally, if you know what order you're going to sort in, you want to do that as early as possible, unless it's a small set. Next topic is replication, and this is definitely something that figures much larger in the DBA exam than it does in the dev exam. But even in the dev exam, you should be familiar with the basic topics of replication. First, configuration of your replica set. You should understand all of your basic settings that you can do. When something you should know what types of servers are eligible to become primary and what types of servers are only going to be secondaries. So for example, if your priority is 0, you're going to be a secondary. You're never going to be primary. If you're a delayed replica set member, you're never going to be primary, which makes sense. Definitely also be familiar with your arbiters, what they're good for, what they're not good for. Obviously, your arbiters can only vote. They can never be elected primary, and they can never store data. The oplog of your server. Definitely understand what its purpose is. Understand, especially for the dev exam, that this is statement-based replication. This has one of the advantages of allowing you to, say, run 2 different servers running different software, maybe different versions of MongoDB, maybe different storage engines, and it'll work just fine. Be aware that the operations that go into the oplog are idempotent, and again, that means that whether you apply the operation once, twice, 50 times, it'll always have the exact same result as if you had applied the operation once. So for example, incrementing a value, pushing a value onto an array, popping a value off of an array, those are not inherently idempotent operations, so something else is going to get stored in the oplog. In the case of incrementing, let's suppose you're incrementing a value from 75 to 76. What would go into the oplog is simply setting that value to 76. If you wanted to pop something off of an array, you would need to simply save the state of the array after that pop into your oplog. That's most of that stuff at the deeper level is probably more DBA, but definitely for the developer, you should understand the basic concepts of the oplog. If I give you an update, you should tell me, okay, if it touches on 5 documents, how many oplog entries are there going to be? Well, there are going to be 5. And again, if I'm saying anything that's confusing, feel free to ask, or if you think it's something you might want to study up on, go to the docs. They do a good job of describing a lot of this. Next up is write concern, which is something you need to be aware of as both a developer and as a DBA. Your write concern determines how many servers you're writing your data to, and whether you're waiting on just volatile memory to get the data before you make an acknowledgement, or whether you are requiring that operation get all the way to disk before acknowledging it. Elections. Be aware of what can trigger an election. When you perform an election, who can be elected primary. A lot of this is going to be much more DBA than developer, but definitely developers should at least be basically aware. If you have an election, is there, like, for example, a tricky situation that sometimes you might want to know is in an election, is it ever possible for a lower priority server to become primary when there's a higher priority server in the replica set? And the answer is yes. There are a couple of circumstances where that might happen. One example would be if that higher priority member is not visible to the rest of the replica set, maybe because it's down, maybe because of a network partition. Another circumstance that might happen is maybe the higher priority oplog member is just behind, or a higher priority replica set member is just behind on its oplog. Only the most current oplog can be chosen to be primary. Let me see. I got a question here. All documentation says we need a majority to have a primary. Is it a majority among the nodes that have votes, or is it a majority over the entire set? The answer is you need to have a majority of the votes. Any server that has a vote of 0 is not going to be counted in that. So if you have 7 voting members, you need 7 votes. If you only have 3, I'm sorry, not 7 votes, 4 votes. If you only have 3 voting members, you're only going to need 2 votes. Keep in mind, once again, this is one of these areas where an arbiter is useful. You should never, 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 never have a replica set with an even number of votes, because you need a strict majority of votes in order to elect a primary. And if you have an even number, you're going to need more than half of that number. So for example, if you have 2 replica set members, you need both of them up in order to elect a primary. If you have 4 replica set members, you need 3 of them up. It's much easier to go to 5 and still only need 3 of them up. If you have an even number of replica set members, you need to add an arbiter. But you should never have more than one arbiter. As long as you're odd, you're in a good situation. Just to clarify, if the voting members are down, we may not have a primary, even though there are several non-voters up. Yes, that is correct. If you don't have a majority of the votes, you will not be able to elect a primary. And if a primary gets isolated and they can no longer see enough votes to be elected primary, that primary will step down. You should be familiar, especially from a DBA perspective, when that happens. So elections, be able to predict your election outcomes depending on the state that we go into it with. Failover, be familiar with when it occurs. It can occur if your primary goes down. It can occur if your primary gets isolated from the other servers. Be aware of when rollback happens, especially for the DBA exam. And what happens when rollback occurs. Rollback specifically is what happens when your primary receives rights that are durable, either because the primary doesn't go down or because the primary has committed them to disk, but these rights don't make it to the rest of the replica set, and a new primary gets elected. And at some point, you've got someone other than the former primary as the new primary. That primary eventually gets reconnected. Those operations get rolled back. They're not going to be part of the replica set. You're going to need to go and find those operations in the rollback directory. Let me see. Okay, it looks like questions are being answered in the forums. Thank you. Finally, deployment to multiple data centers. I think this is a more general version of the problem. And this is definitely going into the DBA perspective on things. So the point of replication is to prevent any single point of failure from taking down your system. The most obvious way that you can do things wrong is if, say, you have all of your MongoD servers on the same server. In that particular case, if that server goes down, your entire replica set goes down. Now, you may be robust in case a single process fails, but it's not as much safety as you're probably going to want. If you split it up into multiple servers, but they're all on the same rack, well, every now and then, a rack in a data center goes down. If you have them on different racks, but they're still in the same data center, now you're getting to a very rare situation, but it's possible for a data center to go down or for a data center to get isolated, partitioned away from the rest of the internet. Ideally, you're going to want to deploy to multiple data centers, and that's That's not just multiple data centers, but ideally each member of your replica set will be in a different data center. That way, any one data center going down will only cause you to lose one server. That's not always possible, but it's sort of an ideal you should be striving for. Be familiar with the fact that, for example, if you have a primary and an arbiter in one data center, and a secondary in another data center, well, if that secondary goes down, you're fine. But if the first data center goes down entirely, you're not going to be able to elect a primary. You'll just be able to use that secondary for backup purposes. All right, sharding. First off, you should know the components of a sharded cluster. This is true for developers as well as DBAs. You should know what goes on your data-bearing servers. You should know what goes in your config servers. You should know what the purpose of your router is and what your router does. Those are the MongoS processes. You should also definitely be familiar with the fact that in terms of components, be aware that each of the nodes in your sharded cluster is itself a replica set. So it's going to be a logical node, which may end up being on multiple servers. Really should be on multiple servers because you don't want to be running a sharded cluster without replication as well. In terms of when to shard, know what sorts of problems sharding solves, know what sorts of problems sharding doesn't solve. For example, if you're looking at a situation where you're, outgrowing your RAM, your working set is getting much larger than your memory, and you're already on a fairly pricey server with lots of RAM. Getting more RAM on a larger server would cost a heck of a lot more. Might be time to shard. On the other hand, if you're on an EC2 micro instance, sharding probably isn't your best option. You may as well just move from a micro to a small, medium, large EC2 instance. Definitely, as long as you're working with commodity servers and you can upgrade commodity servers, it's a good idea too. Yeah. Balancing. Be aware of how the balancer works in a sharded cluster, and this is especially true for DBAs, but developers need to be aware of this as well. Is that we have this concept of chunks, and a chunk, one way to think of it is as a range of the shard key, which we'll be talking about in a second. And when you get too much data in one section, and I don't mean too many documents, I mean too much data because it looks at sort of the size of the data contained within that chunk, it's going to split those chunks as best as it can. And so those chunks are going to multiply over time as you add more data, and then the balancer balances those chunks. And be aware of when that goes right, be aware of when that can go wrong. For example, let's suppose that you chose as your shard key, and this would be an awful, awful choice of shard key, but let's suppose you chose as your shard key, the day of the week on which a person was born. You would only have 7 possible values for that shard key. You could therefore have at most 7 chunks. Even if you had 14 shards, you wouldn't be able to scale out. By the way, I see a general question here. Is it necessary to attend M202 before attending the DBA exam? Most of the topics tested are covered in M102. So we don't have any prerequisites for the exam. You can take them regardless of what you've taken. We would recommend taking M202 for the exam. Yeah, you're right. Most of the topics tested are covered in M102, and it is possible to prepare for the exam on your own. But we do find that people tend to do better if they've taken both M102 and M202 on the exam. That isn't to say that everyone needs to take both, but if you want your best chance of passing, I would recommend it. Okay, So shard keys, be familiar with these ideas we have, like cardinality, the ability of the shard key to split. Be aware of problems that happen with monotonically increasing shard keys. A good example of that is, for example, an incrementing counter, or alternatively, a date time, where every value is going to be necessarily larger than the value that came before that. This also applies to object IDs that you use as your shard key. Ordinarily, when you're using object IDs, you're in a situation where, or any monotonically increasing value of a key, you're going to have one chunk that has everything between sort of whatever value you're on now, say the present time, and all future times. And so all of the data is going to go into that chunk. Now, eventually the chunk will be split and distributed to other servers, so your reads will be, distributed appropriately. But until that happens, all of your inserts are going to happen in a single chunk. And because a single chunk belongs to a single server, all of your inserts are going to happen on that single server. Getting around that is what hashed shard keys are for. That's the main advantage. Be aware of that advantage. Also be aware of the disadvantage, which is ranged queries can become much more expensive. The reason being, if, for example, you want all entries for a particular day, you're going to have to hit all of your servers to gather that information. Now, they're only going to have, some small fraction of that information, but there's still some basic overhead required just to fulfill even a very small query, and you're not going to be able to scale your way out of that. Let me see. Application administration. Here is our first topic that is only for the DBAs, not for the developers. In terms of topics that we look into here, we're going to be looking at data files. Definitely be familiar with the fact that data files in mmap v1 are BSON. Know how a document fits into a record space for a BSON document. What happens when they outgrow those? Journaling. This is not something that developers need to worry about. This is something that DBAs have to worry about. For mmap v1 in particular, journaling is a way of ensuring that your writes are durable and that your data will not be corrupted in the event of a server failure. How do we guarantee this? Well, a journal is a write-ahead log. And ordinarily, if you imagine, you've got some files that are memory mapped to a particular region in virtual memory. When you write in your physical memory, you're going to dirty a page, and that write is going to need to be propagated to disk. If on the disk it writes half the document and then boom, your server goes down, well, that was your only copy of the data. You've now got corrupt data. You've got half a document written. It's not in a consistent state. It would be a problem. This is the problem that journaling solves. By having a write-ahead log, if the server goes down when you're writing to the journal, well, that's fine. The write didn't go through, and you've got the old copy, and everything is fine. If the write finishes, and then the server goes down, well, your data file hasn't been updated yet, but you've got this journal entry. The journal entry is complete. You can change the bytes in the data file to what they should be, and your document has written, and you're in a consistent state. If, on the other hand, your journal entry is written, and then you write part of your data file, and then the server goes down once again, you're in a situation where you're good. The journal entry has the state that it should be in. You copy it over. All is well. By the way, I'm getting a question. Can I talk about elections again later? Absolutely. We'll have some time at the end of this. Ask a question about elections then. We're definitely going to have time to talk about it. Definitely be familiar with authentication and authorization. Understand, the basics of whether or not you can use, SSL and other options. Don't need to know the details of how to implement it. I think that would be a bit much to ask about on a certification exam, but definitely be familiar with the options in terms of MongoDB CR, with the users and the roles and the authentication and the authorization there. Definitely be familiar with that aspect of the database. No. There's a question: is this for Dev 2? All of this is DBA only on application administration. Developers don't need to know this at all. Next, server administration. Once again, DBA only. Developers don't need to know this at all, except in as much as some of these subtopics touch on other exams. Definitely be familiar with performance analysis. What tools might you use? MongoStat, MongoTop, etc. Storage engines. Definitely be familiar with, at the high level, some of the basic trade-offs that you get between the storage engines. Mmap v1 is able to do in-place updates a bit more efficiently. Wired Tiger, on the other hand, comes with a host of advantages. More granular locking, or technically concurrency. You don't have to be updating your indexes when documents grow in Wired Tiger. You have compression, which can frequently help a lot with disk I/O issues, etc. So in that particular case, you're talking about storage engines and their effect on performance, which can be particularly important. Diagnostics and debugging, understand what tools you have available. If I give you a scenario, you may need to walk through and figure out what a plausible bug is given some evidence. Server maintenance, understand, for example, with mmap v1, what command might you do if you say aren't using your space very efficiently. Be familiar with that sort of thing. Backup and recovery. Again, know what your options are. Mongo dump and Mongo restore may be a good idea if it's a relatively small database. Taking a file system snapshot might be a better idea if you have a very large set of data files. And know the importance of capturing the op log as well. We got a question here. Are there questions on the dev exam about the profiler? Because in the course they talked about it. I believe at this point there are no questions about the profiler, but you should be familiar. I can't promise that there won't be questions going forward, but it'll be relatively straightforward. I mean, the profiler is going to capture your operations, long operations if it's set to profiler level 1, all of your operations if it's set to profiler level 2. But I don't think that it's going to be too much of an issue even going forward. Like, I'd be surprised if you'd get more than a couple of questions. There is one question: is monitoring MMS or related topics part of the DBA exam? We're not using the term MMS anymore. I think it's now Cloud Manager and Ops Manager. We try to keep the proprietary aspects of the MongoDB business out of the certification exam. So there are no questions at this time. Let's see. Okay. Preparing for the exam. First off, definitely visit all of the about pages for the exam. They have, a nice list of topics, in many ways more detailed than the ones that I've given you here. You should be looking at those. You should also be looking at the exams page, and that'll include study materials such as Christina Chodoro's book. Keep in mind, I think the last topic they had for that was, let me see, the last version was in 2013. So, some of the newer stuff for the database is going to be obsolete, but it's still a very good book to work from. Definitely be familiar with the MongoDB documentation. It's a great resource. Anytime you know what you want to look up, there's going to be something describing it in all of the detail you need for the exam and then some. Release notes for 3.0, if you've been working, say, with MongoDB 2.6 or 2.4, definitely look at those release notes, see what the new features are, make sure you understand them. You may need to go, deeper into the documentation, but at least that'll list what you need to learn. Like I said, MongoDB, the definitive MongoDB guide, May 2013. You may need to go through some release notes since then, but it's a solid set of things. We got a question here. Will there be questions on deployment options, capacity planning, etc. in the DBA exam? Potentially so. Not necessarily capacity planning in terms of, you have this many reads and this many writes per second. I want you to calculate how many servers you've got, because there's, you're going to need, given the following specs, because that would be a bit more information than could positively determine things. But for example, you should definitely know, the basic idea of when you need to shard. So that'll tell you whether, a replica set deployment is going to be needed or a sharded cluster is going to be needed. You could talk about some problems that are arising in a replica set, and you would be able to say whether or not, it's a good idea to move to a sharded cluster. So questions like those are fair game, but definitely nothing where you would have to state, how many servers you would need, for example. Let me see, another couple of questions here. Do we need to know all the thresholds and limits, like max number of collections in a database? So I wouldn't say you need to know all of them. I don't know the maximum number of collections in a database offhand. And I, write many of the certification exam questions. I try to avoid questions that are overly, sort of about memorization. If there's a question that really isn't good for dividing, between, say, a good DBA and a bad DBA, or a good developer and a bad developer, we definitely try to eliminate them. I can't say that, none of the limits would go in. You might, for example, need to know that you can have at most 7 voting members for a replica set, especially for the DBA exam. Like that strikes me as fair game. Probably that's a little more in the weeds than I would need for a developer exam. How well do we need to know BSON in the structure? Not well at all. Don't spend time looking at BSON documents or memorizing how to convert from JSON to BSON. That's not going to be helpful at all. Just be familiar with the fact that, it's a machine, it's a binary form of JSON, and that the MongoD servers are going to be able to read BSON and reach inside of the documents in order to perform, say, queries that involve dot notation to look at, just sort of subfields. But again, that's, at a relatively high level. Yeah. Moving on. Oh, great place. I love this. And this was something that I used a lot when I was starting out with MongoDB. Just literally the glossary. Go through the entire glossary. It's a little tedious, but it's very good at telling you about things that you don't know, that you didn't know you didn't know. That can be a huge help there. Another thing to look at, especially for the DBAs, just all the server tools that we distribute with MongoDB, type --help. Make sure you understand those options. That is all fair game for the exam. Can I write the glossary URL down? Let me try to make that happen. You can always just Google MongoDB glossary. But let's see if I can pull that up. There we go. Oh, and it looks like Niyati also dropped that in. All right, can you provide a split number of questions that are choose one or more options versus the ones with only one correct answer? That I cannot give. That's actually going to depend on the person. In many cases, questions are drawn randomly from a pool of questions that look similar. So you're not going to be able to know in advance, what the ratio is. You should best be prepared for both of them. There are going to be a lot of each. It's not as though one, completely dominates over the other. Let me see. Is this okay? So it's time for us to spend a few minutes. I think I'm going to give you guys about 15 minutes. I don't think this is correct anymore. There aren't 20 questions. There should be 10 questions. I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you rather than 10 minutes. I'm going to give you 15 minutes. I'm going to mute things. Let me see. By the way, another question. Do you need to know MapReduce? No. There's nothing on MapReduce. There is something on aggregation. Is there an option to skip a question and come back to it later? Yes, absolutely. There will be an ability to flag those questions and see which questions you haven't answered. For the Dev exam, do you need to know geospatial indexes, MongoStat, and MongoTop? Yes, definitely. Yes on all three. Let me see. I want to throw this URL in here. Okay, that looks correct. Actually, yes, is. So here is the link for that little practice exam with 10 questions. Text indexes and operators. Definitely be familiar with the basics of text indexes for the Dev exam, not for the DBA exam. Same when it comes to geospatial indexes. That wouldn't be on the DBA exam. It might be on the Dev exam. Be familiar with how to do a text index query. Yeah. All right. Okay, so I'm going to leave you. I'm going to turn off my microphone for about, I'll give you about 12 minutes, and we'll come back at 6:21 p.m. Eastern Time and go through the exam. All right, Will Cross here. I am back. So, certification exam study session quiz. We got a few questions here. I've given you about 12 minutes for 10 questions, which is maybe a little bit less time than you'll have on the actual exam. Hopefully you guys didn't find it to be too quick. We'll go through these now, and then I'll stick around and answer questions for a few minutes. Okay, from the given list, which kind of indexes are possible to create in MongoDB? Hashed indexes you can definitely create. Text search indexes. Maybe this could have been phrased better, but it is a practice quiz. It doesn't go through that much vetting. Function-based indexes are not something you can create in MongoDB 3.0. So there you have it. So you would, check 2 out of 3, and again, if you had all 3 checked, you would get it wrong. You would get no credit. If you had only 1 question or 1 checked, you would get it wrong. Yeah. Question number 2, which of the following can be different from one replica set member to another in the same set? Check all that apply. Indexes, actually, you don't need to have them on every replica set member. If you create them on the primary, they will propagate to secondaries, but you can take a secondary, detach it from a replica set, build an index, and then reattach it into the replica set, and thereby have an index that doesn't show up on the primary. Also, your MongoDB version doesn't have to be the same for every member of the replica set. We use statement-based replication rather than, say, binary replication, where it might have sort of a data file and an offset. So this can vary. Documents, on the other hand, your basic data, that's got to be the same. Goes from the primary, gets replicated on through the outlog to the secondaries. It's got to be constant. That's the whole point of replication. Let's see. Which of the following commands returns the information on database file size? db.stats would give you the information. db.collection.status is not a command, and db.serverStatus will record operations but does not give you the database size. We've got a question, what about slave delay? Obviously, slave delay is only operative on a secondary. You can't have that on your primary, so you wouldn't be able to have that on every replica set member. That's the sort of option that you can apply, only to a secondary, not a primary. What is the command to shard a collection? db.enable sharding is not a command. sh.enable sharding will work on a database, but sh.shard collection is the command that you want. sh.enable sharding, that won't shard a particular collection. Aggregation. Which of the following is not a pipeline in the aggregation stage? So $filter is the only one that's not here. Sort, limit, group, and match are all valid things. $filter looks a lot like $match. Yeah. Where should I place the match stage of my aggregation pipeline in order to be able to use an index? It has to be before your first group or project stage. Prior to that, your indexes will be recognized. After that, it's not really the same collection that you started out with, so your indexes are no longer going to apply. And here we've got a few more questions, sort of generally. Which of the following MongoDB features can help you prevent data loss due to the failure of a single server? Replication is definitely the answer you want to go for. Your secondary can step up in the event of failover. Sharding is not about preventing data loss. MongoStat is a useful feature, but not about data loss. Indexes, again, it's a good idea to have indexes on every document. You have to, as a matter of fact, because the _ID index applies to every document. But that's not as though it's going to help you guard against data loss. And finally, routing all queries through a MongoS process. Well, that basically sounds like sharding. The only correct answer here is replication. We do have a question. Will we be able to access this quiz URL if you want to practice later on? I am not 100% sure. Okay, we got an answer. Yes, you will be able to. Yeah, we don't plan to take it down. We might modify things slightly. We might not, but it should stay up. Okay. Number 8, consider the sample collection, which contains only the following documents. How many of these documents would be affected by the following query? And we want to remove, and we pass it this document. Well, where X is 1 and Y is 2, it looks like this document and this document are both going to apply. So the correct answer would be 2 documents. Number 9, when would you use the explain method on a cursor? When I want metadata about the collection? No, that's not a great way to learn metadata. If I want to know why the database is performing the query, I'm not sure even how to make sense of that answer. That's a question you'd have to go to the developers for. If you want to know which index is being used for a query, yes, absolutely. The explain method will work there. Do you want to know the status of the server? No, db.serverStatus is the way to do that. And when you want to know the schema of a collection, actually you could get that by querying, but not with an explain method. So no. And finally, number 10, in the context of a sharded cluster, which of the following is or are true of chunks? The default chunk size changes automatically to meet the needs of an application. No, default chunk size determines when chunks are split, but it certainly wouldn't change automatically. The ranges of 2 chunks overlap. That is true. Your chunk size, as given in the database, is going to be inclusive of a lower bound and exclusive of the upper bound. So it may look like there's a single point where two chunks are touching, but they're actually not touching. And no two chunk ranges ever overlap. No document will ever belong, for example, to two chunks. And every chunk is assigned to a particular shard. This is also true. You never have a shard where, let me see, you never have a chunk that is sort of unassigned to any shard at all. Are there any other, we got a question, are there any other quizzes we can access? Certainly none that we're providing right now, but that may change in the future. As of right now, this is the main, sort of small set of quizzes that we're working from. All right, so this was the review session. I think we're due to end in 1 minute, but I'm going to stick around until the questions run out. I want to make sure that I answer all of your questions. So yeah, you can type them into the text box. You can come on and ask me a question. Yeah, I'll be here until the questions are done. All right, we got a question. Which of the following can be different from one replica set member to another in the same set? Slave delay wouldn't cause documents to be... You know what, Ken? I think you're right. I think you caught me on a technicality. I'm glad that question is in the practice exam, not the final exam. That would cause documents to be different from one replica set to a member to another. I had not considered that. I think I'm going to go in and change that question. Good catch. I like it. Let's see. We've got a question. For the developer exam, will there be Python or JavaScript code questions? So there definitely won't be Python or any other driver-specific questions. There might be some lightweight JavaScript of the sort that you would find in the shell. For loops are fair game, so you'd best be able to interpret those. Typically, it would be, say, a for loop enclosing, some sort of a MongoDB, say, insert or update or find command or something of that nature. But even there, it would be fairly rare, and it would be pretty obvious what was going on. We're not going to be checking to make sure that you know your JavaScript. Just lightweight type questions. And like I said, definitely nothing in Python, nothing in C#, nothing driver specific. Another question, are there questions about aggregation framework in a sharded environment? Yes, that is potentially fair game. For example, you would want to know that, your shards are going to pass information to the primary, which then is going to do a merge sort on your data before passing it on. That is the sort of thing that you should be aware of. Absolutely. Another question, will preparing using the Chodoro book be enough for the developer exam? I would say probably not, given how old the latest version is. I would definitely look at the release notes. I would definitely read up on the MongoDB glossary to make sure you fill in the gaps. It's a really good book. It tells a great story of what you needed to know for the database in terms of MongoDB 2.4. But the database has changed since then, and unfortunately the book hasn't. By the way, thank you all. And definitely good luck on the exam. Yeah. And like I said, I'm going to wait here. If I see a few minutes without any questions, I'm probably going to stop answering them. But other than that, I should be here. Here is a question. Should we take the exam in one stretch? I'm afraid you don't have an option. Once you start the exam, you only have 90 minutes to finish the exam. So that's how it's going to have to work. Oh, here's a question. Can we go over elections again? You know what? This is a good opportunity. Let's go to the docs and start looking for elections there. Let's see. Start just by saying MongoDB elections, replica set elections, top result. So here's a pretty good sense of what's going on in an election. So one example of how to trigger an election: you eliminate your primary, the remaining secondaries, they see each other, they're going to call for an election, and a new primary is going to be elected. Let me answer a side question real quick. Someone asks how many questions during the 90 minutes. Somewhere between 60 and 75. And typically we tend to be towards the low end of that, depending on the exam. But yeah, that's more or less what you should expect. So factors that can affect elections: definitely heartbeats, priority comparisons. The highest priority is going to be elected whenever possible. Members with a priority of 0 cannot become primary. Definitely be aware of that. And okay, let me see, if the highest priority secondary, or let me see, if a secondary with higher priority is at least 10 seconds behind on the op log, that is to say its op time is 10 seconds behind another, the one with the most current op log is going to be elected, and it won't hold an election until the higher priority member catches up to within 10 seconds of the op log entry of the current primary. Let me see. Op time is the timestamp. Those are the major issues, but again, know your election triggering events. You can initiate a new replica set. A secondary can lose contact with the primary and call for an election, or a primary can step down. Primary will step down after a REPL set step down command is given. If one of the current secondaries is eligible for election and has higher priority, and if the primary cannot contact a majority of members of the replica set, it will step down. Let's see. Every member has a priority that helps determine its eligibility to become a primary. By default, all members have a priority of 1. So, this is exactly what I do anytime I have a topic and I want to study. I literally will Google it, go to the documentation. It usually comes up best with a Google search. I mean, for example, if you look over here on the left, you may not jump immediately to this particular item in the nav bar, particularly if you can't see it, initially. But usually Google does a good job of finding it. Here we've got votes, or sorry, not votes, vetoes in an election. And this is, pretty in the weeds, definitely DBA only. But for example, an election will be vetoed if the member seeking an election isn't a member of the voters set. That should never happen, but any member could veto it if that happens. If the member seeking an election is not up to date with the most recent operation accessible in the replica set, it's going to get vetoed to make sure that you don't elect as primary something that's behind when something more current is available. If the member seeking an election has a lower priority than another member in the set that is also eligible for election, it's going to get vetoed. If a priority 0 member has the most current op time in the election, it's going to get vetoed because you don't want that election happening when a priority 0 member is the one that's going to be elected. Or if the current primary has more recent operations, i.e. a higher op time than a member seeking election from the perspective of the voting member, it can veto the election. And finally, it'll veto it, if the current primary has the same or more recent operations than the member seeking election. Be aware of, sort of non-voting members. Here we've got a replica set with 9 members. 7 of them are voting. 2 of them are non-voting. They have no votes. That's a legal setup to have. So yeah, this is a pretty good page that really talks about, the mechanics of the elections. I think it's a pretty good place to reference. Other questions? Let's see. Oh, I just realized I've gotten behind. What about aggregation for the DBA exam? What do you need to know about sharding and aggregation? For the DBA exam, you really only need to know the basics of aggregation. Know your basic stages, be able to recognize a valid aggregation. If I ask for an aggregation that does something and I give you a few options, or you get a few options, be able to choose among them. You're not going to need to go too deep into the weeds, and there aren't going to be a lot of questions. Let's see. Which sections usually have more questions for developers? It's going to depend to a certain amount on the exam, but usually, CRUD operations have a number, obviously relative to DBA. DBA would have no questions. On data modeling, the developer would have all the questions. Indexes are important. Really, sort of all of the sections that appear are fair game. Typically, developers would not have a whole lot of questions, though, on, say, storage engines. That's, not a huge developer thing. Let me see. Election during failover in different data centers. There's a question about that. So the presence of different replica set members in different data centers should not affect failover at all, except in as much as, it may affect where, for example, a network partition may hit. But once that partition is in place, the basic topology of the replica set and the state of each of the members is going to determine the outcome of failover, is going to determine the outcome of the election. Does that answer your question? Oh, okay. Let me try again. So we may potentially ask a question, if a data center goes down, what's going to happen in this election? And that may depend on the location of different replica set members, in the different data centers prior to a data center going down. Yeah. Other than that, it shouldn't affect things too much. Definitely, be able to answer, okay, if a data center goes down and these are the guys that are in that data center, you may need to infer which members are down, or if there's a network partition around a data center, you need to infer what members are going to be affected. But that's really the extent of the interaction between data centers and a replica set that you need to know. There is a question about pass percentage. I'm afraid we don't answer questions like that. That is information that we don't release. I apologize for that. Other questions at this point? Until when can we decide to do the exam? I'm not sure I follow the question. Niyati may be able to answer that better. I'm not sure what factors can affect that. So I don't want to answer in case I say something wrong. By the way, that's a good question. If you don't get an answer, you can definitely email certification@mongodb.com. I'm going to put that in here. And yeah. We got a question. I don't understand the purpose of the primary shard. Okay. So here is another case where I think I'm gonna go to the documentation. MongoDB primary shard. And here we go. Every database has a primary shard, we can see. And it holds all the unsharded collections in the database. Let me see. This doesn't specifically say anything about the... doesn't say anything specifically about aggregation pipeline. Let me see. Sharded cluster aggregation. Okay. Aggregation pipeline and sharded collections. When operating on a sharded collection, the aggregation pipeline is split into a couple of parts. The first pipeline part runs on each shard, or if an early match can exclude shards through the use of the shard key and the predicate, the pipeline runs only on the relevant shards. So basically, you're going to look at a couple of stages. One stage is everything that can be done in parallel. Following that, you're going to have, things that need to be done serially or all together. So the second pipeline of the remaining pipeline stages consists of the remaining pipeline stages and runs on the primary shard. So the primary shard, once again, it's this shard for storing unsharded collections of a database, of a particular database. It also captures, anything that can't be run in parallel for an aggregation pipeline. It's going to merge the cursors from the other shards and runs the second pipeline on those results. And finally, it forwards the results to the MongoS. In previous versions, by the way, and this isn't relevant for you guys, so don't memorize it, but prior to MongoDB 2.6, so it might have run the second pipeline on a MongoS. But it's recognized that MongoS's are often lightweight processes, so we changed that in 2.6. Let's see. Any other questions? Looks like there have been a few questions for Niyati that she's been fielding. Once again, you think of any other questions, please email us, certification@mongodb.com. We're happy to answer. Thank you all so much for coming. Like I said, I'm gonna wait a few more minutes to see if someone comes up with another question. Otherwise, have a good night.